Hey, everybody, welcome to Redeemer. And this Wednesday reflection, we're talking all about Richard Hooker. Richard Hooker's feast day was a few days ago, and I didn't have a chance to comment or post anything about it. And Hooker is an amazing theologian and part of Anglican history, especially just the English Reformation in general. Now, without getting into tons of details about his life and all these things, I just want to focus on one popular statement of Hooker's that is used again and again across Anglicanism and the Episcopal Church here in America, and that is Hooker's three-legged stool, which is the basis of Anglican theology, that the church is based on Scripture, tradition, and reason, the three-legged stool that holds up the church. Except that Hooker never said that. Now, what did happen was that after Hooker passed away, years and years and years continued on with the church, and the Oxford movement of priests and theologians and thinkers were hearkening back to glory days of the early Anglican Church, and they attached onto Hooker this idea of a three-legged stool and Scripture, tradition, and reason, kind of giving their own ideas of returning to a more traditional form of church, even if it wasn't necessarily theologically, Roman. It looked more Roman, and so they threw back to early thinkers in the church like Hooker to kind of a hook to put their hat on. But Hooker never said that. He never used a three-legged stool. He did use the term a threefold cord, a braided cord, if you will, that was not Scripture, tradition, and reason, but the Bible, church, and reason. And why did these things get conflated? Well, to answer that question, we look back at Hooker's life. Hooker was born during, basically, he lived during the reign of Elizabeth. And he was born into a Protestant England. He was definitely a product of that Protestant thought. And when he was coming up and he thought he was, being a good Protestant, he was also pushing up against a lot of the zealous puritanical, and I mean like actual Puritans, not just an adjective. Like he was bumping up against Puritans who were pushing him on his statements because they weren't far enough. With the Puritan movement in England, they wanted to do a top-down or a bottom-up whole reorganizing of the church. Basically, the medieval church did not resemble what a church should look like according to Scripture, in their view. And so because of that, we just needed to scrap the whole thing and build a fresh one, which is what the Puritans did. But with that kind of zealot or zealous enthusiasm, that kind of puts a lot of the onus on the person. Well, if you don't agree, if you agree with that part, well, then you must not agree with any of it, and you're not a Christian. If you don't go all the way with us as Puritans, then you're not Christian. And it was those little parts that caused Hooker to have trouble. He was giving sermons in London, and his assistant was nitpicking counterpoints in his sermons, and then they would have these basically kind of like a sermon war or not a war, but a battle where one would give a sermon, one would have a response sermon, another sermon would be in response to that, and this kept going on and on and on for weeks and weeks. And finally, Hooker wrote the Laws of Ecclesial Polity, which is like his seminal work that really defines a lot of, theology and thoughts on how the church should run itself and how members of the church should work. And it really is an amazing piece of work. And in that laws of ecclesial polity. He talks about the threefold cord of church, the Bible, and reason. And what he's doing is he's helping basically create what we would call a middle way, a balance. Because, if, again, as I said, if you had the more and more extreme you get in your position, the more consequence you have from it. So if you have, it's that whole point of like, well, if you don't believe this, then you're reading the Bible wrong, and so you're not a Christian because you don't believe in the Bible. The Puritans were, very, very adamant about the Bible being the only authority for life, and Hooker was just like, wait a minute. If there are important things that a Christian should do, then Scripture will address it and will give a decision on that. However, as we can clearly see, the Bible doesn't speak to every situation, and so from those situations where the Bible does not address a position or an answer, we must infer, given our best judgment, what that should be. So the Puritans would say, well, if it's not in the Bible, then it's not of God. And so, they're using Scripture to find a reason to explain everything. Whereas Hooker was saying, like, there are just things the Bible just doesn't address. We have to, use our God-given reason to find, to fill in the gap. Likewise, if we have figures of authority, like Scripture is an authority, but also state leaders and politicians are authorities. The police are an authority. We have authorities in our lives. We have parents and grandparents and things like that, bosses. Those are all authorities. And so, do you only obey the Bible to the detriment of every relationship you have? Hooker would say no. Where something would be against Christian teaching, you must be compelled to not do that. However, if something doesn't clash with Christian teaching, then you should be able to follow that leader as well. And there is a balancing act. There are times when, you have good options or you have two bad options, and you have to figure out what to do with it. And so Hooker's writing was trying to figure out a way to bridge that gap. And so, again, Hooker's threefold cord was church, Bible, and reason. It got morphed along the way into Scripture, tradition, and reason, where you replace the word church, with tradition. Because, again, the Oxford movement people were trying to figure out a way to remake the church within itself, as far as how it would, the architecture it used, the liturgy it used, the vestments they used, things like that. And so they were much more doing some fine-tuning within the church, not just a wholesale abandonment of the established church at the time. Because when it came to it, Hooker, for his time, was a product of Protestant England, but also was much more happy with the form and function of the medieval church. A better way of encapsulating Hooker's tension between secular and biblical authority, or church and governmental authority, or familial authority, all these different authorities, and how we balance, who do we pay attention to. He says, what Scripture doth plainly deliver, to that the first both and credit and obedience is due. Next, whereunto is whatsoever any man necessarily conclude by force of reason. After these the voice of the church succeedeth. That which the church by her ecclesiastical authority shall probably think and define and be true or good, must in congruity of reason overrule all other inferior judgments whatsoever. Basically, there is room for discussion, there is room for reason, and there is a hierarchy. It's not like a stool where you have three equally weighted legs that are doing an equal amount of support are equally important. Certainly, what Hooker would agree is that Scripture would be the base of the pyramid, and then church would be next, and then reason would be above that. And so that while there are weightier authorities, certainly reason and the established church, or the precedent of what's been going on, do come into play as far as balancing those judgments. And so that's a brief discussion of Thomas Cranmer and the three-legged stool, which wasn't a three-legged stool. It was a threefold cord. But anyway, that is something that we can talk more about. That's all I have for my reflection today. I wish you all well, and as always, dear ones, God bless.